The Nile Delta is often seen as the birthplace of ancient Egypt's power, lush, fertile, and undeniably Egyptian. But what if the first people to settle there weren't Egyptian at all? What if, long before pyramids and pharaohs, outsiders made their way up the Mediterranean coast and laid the earliest foundations of life in the Delta? New discoveries in ancient DNA are upending everything we thought we knew about Egypt's beginnings. They suggest that the earliest inhabitants of the Delta may have come not from the Nile Valley itself, but from across the sea. Before we start, I'm on a road to get 1,000 subscribers as a small channel. If you want to help me, please subscribe. The Nile Delta sits at the northern tip of Egypt, where the mighty river fans out and meets the Mediterranean Sea. This region, with its rich silt and abundant water, has been called the breadbasket of ancient Egypt. Stretching across more than 20,000 square kilometers, it was home to bustling communities, farmlands, temples, and cities, even before the pyramids rose in the south. For decades, archaeologists believed that the Nile Delta was settled by people migrating northward from Upper Egypt, following the river and establishing early pre-dynastic societies around 6000 BCE. These communities were thought to share the same genetic, linguistic, and cultural background as their southern neighbors, eventually blending into the great unified civilization of ancient Egypt. This model painted the Delta as a natural extension of the Nile Valley's internal development. But archaeological hints, long overlooked, suggested that the story might not have been so straightforward. Archaeologists working in the Nile Delta began to notice puzzling patterns in some of the region's oldest sites. Certain ceramic styles didn't match those found upriver in Upper Egypt. Stone tools at select locations resembled Levantine traditions more than anything native to the Nile Valley. Animal bones from some early layers pointed to unfamiliar livestock types, species not typically seen in early Egyptian contexts. And even the layout of some pre-dynastic settlements didn't align with patterns known from southern Egypt. Scholars debated whether these were signs of trade, imitation, or something more direct. But without clear evidence, the anomalies remained speculative. The question lingered in academic circles. Had the Nile Delta been settled entirely from within the Nile corridor, or had it, at least in part, been colonized by people from outside Egypt, perhaps arriving by sea or skirting the coast? It was a mystery without a conclusive answer, until ancient DNA gave us a glimpse beneath the surface. Recovering DNA from ancient human remains in Egypt is notoriously difficult. The Delta's warm, humid conditions, combined with high microbial activity in the soil, degrade genetic material quickly. For years, these challenges kept Egypt off the map in ancient genomics, but new methods are changing that. Researchers targeted burials from several pre-dynastic sites in the northern Delta, dated between 5,500 and 3,000 BCE. By carefully sampling the petrous part of the temporal bone, one of the densest bones in the body, they were able to extract fragments of ancient DNA. Using hybridization capture techniques and single nucleotide polymorphism (SNP) panels, they retrieved genomic profiles from over a dozen individuals. These were then compared with thousands of ancient and modern genomes from Africa, the Middle East, and Europe. What emerged from this painstaking analysis was unexpected. The genetic signature of many early Delta individuals did not closely match that of Nile Valley populations to the south, but pointed elsewhere. The genomic results revealed a startling pattern. Several early individuals from the Nile Delta showed strong genetic affinity with Neolithic populations from the Levant and Anatolia. These weren't minor traces, but substantial segments of DNA indicating recent ancestry from across the Mediterranean. Some individuals carried genomic profiles almost indistinguishable from those found in early farming communities of the southern Levant, modern-day Israel and Jordan, while others had closer ties to Western Anatolian groups. These ancient migrants didn't resemble the indigenous North African populations or the emerging pre-dynastic communities of Upper Egypt. Instead, their DNA suggested a migration event, people who crossed into Egypt via the Mediterranean coast and settled in the fertile Delta. This genetic influx appears to have occurred during the early Neolithic, around 6000 BCE, before Egyptian unification. It implies that the first farmers of the Delta were not simply extensions of Nile Valley cultures, but newcomers from entirely different regions with their own ancestral backgrounds. The genetic evidence supports a two-phase model of Nile Delta settlement. In the first wave, around 6000 BCE, Small groups of Neolithic farmers likely arrived from the eastern Mediterranean, possibly sailing along the coast or crossing via the Sinai. These early settlers brought with them domesticated plants, animals, and a suite of technologies distinct from the Nile Valley. Their presence reshaped the local landscape, introducing new farming techniques and possibly new languages. Then, about a millennium later, a second wave arrived, this time from Upper Egypt. These were the ancestors of the emerging Egyptian state, carrying a different genetic and cultural profile. As these southern migrants moved northward, they began to integrate with, or possibly displace, the earlier Levantine-descended communities. Over time, the delta became a melting pot where multiple ancestries and cultural traditions merged. But initially, it seems the people who first cultivated the delta's rich land weren't Egyptians at all. They were farmers from far away. Ancient DNA wasn't the only line of evidence pointing to distinct origins. Cultural markers reinforced the genetic divide. Early delta settlements associated with Levantine ancestry showed architectural layouts, burial customs, and ceramic designs that differed sharply from those in the Nile Valley. While southern Egyptian groups favored elongated pit burials and Nubian-style pottery, these northern communities often used flexed burials and Levantine-style ceramics. Genetically, the two groups remained relatively separate in the earliest phases, with limited interbreeding. This suggests that the delta functioned as a frontier zone, where incoming populations maintained cultural boundaries before gradual blending took place in later periods. The uniparental DNA markers, mitochondrial DNA from mothers and Y chromosomes from fathers, added another layer to the story. Early delta individuals carried mtDNA haplogroups such as T2 and K1, both common among Neolithic Anatolian and Levantine farmers. On the paternal side, Y-DNA haplogroups like J2 and G2A, frequently associated with early farming expansions from the Near East, were identified. In contrast, later individuals from Upper Egypt carried haplogroups like M1A and EM35, more typical of North African and East African ancestry. These distinctions highlight a genetic shift over time, reinforcing the idea that the delta was first colonized by Eastern populations before later integration into Egypt's southern dynastic world. These genetic and archaeological findings require a re-evaluation of how we understand the Nile Delta's role in Egyptian history. Far from being a passive extension of Nile Valley culture, the delta appears to have had an independent and dynamic early history, initially shaped by migration from outside Africa. The traditional narrative placed Egypt's origins solely within the continent, developing in isolation until later Mediterranean contact. But the DNA tells a more complex story. The delta wasn't just fertile land, it was a landing point, a crossroads where Eurasian farming cultures took root and later fused with indigenous African societies. This layered origin helps explain why early delta cultures sometimes differed from those of Upper Egypt in burial rites, material culture, and even social structure. Rather than a single, unified trajectory, the formation of ancient Egypt now looks like a braided stream, fed by multiple human currents flowing from both the African interior and the eastern Mediterranean. This groundbreaking research opens the door to further exploration. Scientists aim to sample older, deeper burial layers in the delta to see just how early Eastern ancestry arrived. Comparing these results with ancient genomes from sites in the Levant, Anatolia, and even Cyprus may help identify the exact source populations. There's also growing interest in analyzing plant and animal DNA to trace the movement of farming practices across regions. Could some of the delta's crops have arrived before people? And what role did climate shifts or sea level changes play in shaping migration routes? The genetic story is still unfolding, and many secrets lie waiting in the soil. The Nile Delta, long considered a heartland of ancient Egypt, is revealing itself to be something even more fascinating, a prehistoric meeting ground between continents. The first people to settle its fertile fields weren't simply moving downstream from the Nile, they were coming from across the sea, bringing with them new genes, new tools, and new ways of life. Ancient DNA is reshaping how we understand Egypt's beginnings, showing us that human history is rarely as simple as we imagined. What other ancient frontiers are waiting to be re-explored? Let me know in the comments, like and share this video, and don't forget to subscribe to support more deep dives like this.